There are places in the world where history always had an escape route. If a civilization failed, it could migrate, conquer, merge, or disappear into something larger. But there is one place on Earth where that was never an option. A place so isolated that once you arrived, the rest of the world effectively ceased to exist. No borders to cross, no allies to seek, no enemies to blame, just an island, just the sky, just an endless ocean in every direction. That place is Easter Island. Here, humanity carried out one of its most extreme experiments. A complex, intelligent, deeply symbolic society trapped inside a closed system, forced to face the consequences of its own decisions without relief or rescue. This is not a story about mysterious statues. It is the story of real people who built a world and then had to live inside it until the very end. The story of Rapa Nui begins with an achievement that still challenges modern understanding. Polynesian navigators set out across the Pacific Ocean without maps, compasses, or written charts. But they were not reckless explorers. They were masters of oceanic knowledge accumulated over generations. They read the sea as a living system, the shape of swells reflecting off distant land, the flight patterns of birds that never slept at sea, the color of clouds anchored to islands still beyond the horizon. Navigation was not chance. It was memory, observation, and discipline passed orally from master to apprentice. When they finally reached Rapa Nui, they found an untouched ecosystem. Massive palm forests covered the island. Birds nested everywhere. The volcanic soil was fertile, and the sea provided abundant food. There were no ruins, no warnings, no signs of earlier inhabitants. For these settlers, the island was not a prison. It was a promise, a new beginning. What they could not know was that they had entered the most closed human system imaginable. From that moment on, everything that happened on the island would have to be solved on the island. There would be no second chances. Rapa Nui society was not built only on survival. From early on, it developed a worldview where the living and the dead coexisted in the same reality. Ancestors did not disappear after death. They continued to influence crops, fishing success, fertility, and social order. Power was linked to mana, a spiritual force associated with lineage, prestige, and sacred authority. Leaders ruled not merely through force, but through their perceived connection to ancestral power. The island was divided into clans, each controlling specific territories, sacred spaces, and rituals. Memory was preserved orally, reinforced through ceremony and tradition. For generations, this system worked. Resources were sufficient. Conflict existed, but remained contained. Balance was maintained, but prestige is never static. And when prestige becomes competition, even stable societies begin to shift. At some point, the Rapa Nui people decided that memory itself should become permanent. That decision gave birth to the Moai. These statues were not gods. They were representations of powerful ancestors, physical vessels meant to channel protective spiritual energy toward the living. That is why the Moai face inland, watching over villages, rather than looking out to sea. At first, the statues were relatively modest, but soon size began to matter. A larger Moai meant greater prestige, stronger ancestry, higher status. What began as reverence slowly became rivalry. Clans competed to build taller, heavier, more imposing statues. Some Moai were crowned with massive red stone topknots, making them even more monumental. The island gradually filled with stone faces, each one silently asserting power. No one asked whether this escalation had a physical limit. On a small, isolated island, assuming infinite resources was the first invisible mistake. Transporting a Moai was a collective achievement on a scale rarely matched in human history. Dozens or even hundreds of people worked in perfect coordination, using ropes, leverage, and practical physics knowledge refined over generations. There were no wheels, no metal tools, no draft animals, just human intelligence. Over time, Transportation techniques evolved, eventually allowing statues to be walked upright through controlled rocking motions. But every method required enormous amounts of wood for ropes, sleds, levers, and infrastructure. For a long time, deforestation did not seem dangerous. The forests appeared vast, but on a closed island, every tree cut was permanent. Wood was not only needed for statues. It was essential for canoes, houses, tools, and deep-sea fishing. Stopping the construction of Moai was not simple. To stop meant losing prestige, authority, and legitimacy. So the society continued forward, even as warning signs became increasingly clear. The disappearance of the forests marked the point of no return. Without trees, large canoes could no longer be built. Deep-sea fishing declined, soil erosion worsened. Crops failed more often. Birds vanished, diets narrowed. Hunger arrived slowly, but relentlessly. As resources declined, tensions between clans escalated. The spiritual system that had once maintained order began to crack. Moai, once symbols of protection, became reminders of a broken promise. And then the unthinkable happened. The statues began to fall. Not by invaders, but by the Rapa Nui themselves. Toppling a Moai was a powerful political act. It signaled rejection of the old order and acknowledgement that ancestral protection had failed. Violence increased. Desperation spread. The society did not collapse because it was primitive, but because it was trapped inside a system that could no longer sustain it. When Europeans arrived in the 18th century, they encountered a society already exhausted. They did not see the rise, only the aftermath. What followed was not rescue, but devastation. Introduced diseases killed thousands. Slave raids removed large portions of the population. Social structures disintegrated. Oral traditions fragmented. The mysterious Rongorongo script lost its readers. Within a few generations, a civilization that had survived centuries of extreme isolation stood on the brink of cultural extinction. Internal ecological collapse had weakened the island. External contact finished the process. For decades, Easter Island was presented as a lesson in human self-destruction. But that interpretation is incomplete. The Rapa Nui were not ignorant. They were highly intelligent, adaptable, and resilient. Their tragedy was not stupidity, but success in a finite environment. Rapa Nui is Earth in miniature. Limited resources, isolation, cumulative decisions. There was no single fatal mistake, only thousands of small ones that gradually closed every exit. The remaining Moai do not accuse, they reflect. They remind us that civilizations rarely collapse suddenly. They collapse while believing there is still time. The Moai still stand, silent, unblinking, watching an island very different from the one they once knew. Their silence is not mystery. It is memory. Memory of a society that achieved the impossible under impossible conditions and left behind a question carved in stone. If a civilization this capable could not stop itself in a closed world, what makes us believe that we can? Because when the last resource disappears, history does not negotiate. And Rapa Nui learned that lesson before anyone else.